The sound of hooves on frozen mud came too fast. Cora Everly looked up from her newspaper proofs, just as the freight wagon careened past her office window, the team wild-eyed and out of control. She barely had time to register the danger before strong hands grabbed her shoulders and yanked her backward off the boardwalk. The wagon wheel missed her skirt hem by inches, spraying cold mud across the planks where she had been standing. Her rescuer released her the moment they were clear. Cora spun around, heart hammering, and found herself staring into the steady, unreadable eyes of Wyatt Cutter. The freight foreman stood too close, his breath visible in the winter air, his hands still slightly raised, as if she might bolt. Half the town had stopped to watch. Mrs. Kowalski stood frozen outside the mercantile. Young Timothy Harper gaped from the doorway of the feed store. Even old Samuel Holt had paused mid-sweep on the hotel steps. Cora's pulse roared in her ears. 3 weeks ago, this man had cost her everything. 3 weeks ago, his testimony at the land office had confirmed that her late father's claim to the Larkspur Ranch was invalid, built on forged documents and lies. The inheritance she had believed would secure her future had vanished in a single afternoon. And Wyatt Cutter had been the one to produce the proof that destroyed it. Now he stood before her like some kind of hero, expecting gratitude. The slap cracked across the cold air before she could think it through. Her palm stung. Wyatt's head barely moved, but his jaw tightened, and something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. The watching crowd sucked in a collective breath. Cora felt the weight of every stare, the scandal blooming around them like smoke. But she could not make herself care. "You do not get to save me," she wanted to say. "You do not get to stand there and pretend you did not ruin everything." But she said nothing. She turned on her heel and walked back into the Blue Bend Gazette office, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Her hands shook as she leaned against the doorframe. Outside, she heard the murmur of voices, the shuffle of boots, the creak of Wyatt Cutter walking away. She had just committed social suicide in front of half the town. By nightfall, everyone in Blue Bend would know that the newspaper editor had slapped the man who saved her life. They would call her ungrateful. They would call her hysterical. They would say grief over her father had made her unreasonable. They would not know the truth. They could never know the truth. Cora pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and watched Wyatt's broad back disappear down the street. She had built her entire life in Blue Bend on the fiction that her father was an honest man. The newspaper, the respect, the place she had carved for herself as the only woman editor in 3 counties. All of it rested on a foundation of lies. And Wyatt Cutter held the proof that could shatter what little remained. She could not afford his rescue. She could not afford his pity. She could not afford him at all. The next morning brought frost thick enough to etch flowers on every window in town. Cora arrived at the Gazette office before dawn, as she always did, and found a crate waiting on her doorstep. No note, no markings, just rough pine boards and the faint smell of machine oil. She dragged it inside and pried the lid open with the iron poker from the stove. Newsprint. 6 reams of quality stock, the kind she had been trying to afford for 2 months. The kind that cost more than she could justify spending, now that the ranch inheritance had evaporated and her savings were bleeding away on office rent and ink. Cora stared at the paper for a long moment. Then she closed the crate, carried it back outside, and left it on the boardwalk with a piece of chalk scrawled across the lid. Return to sender. She would not take his charity. She would not take anything from Wyatt Cutter. By mid-morning, the crate was gone. By noon, a second delivery arrived. This time, it was lamp oil. 4 sealed tins that would keep her press running through the winter. Cora sent it back. The third delivery came at dusk. A side of salt pork and a sack of cornmeal. Provisions that would have stretched her grocery budget by weeks. She hauled it all to the freight office herself, her arms aching and her breath coming hard in the cold. Wyatt stood in the loading yard, supervising the unloading of a wagon train, his coat dusted with snow and his expression unreadable. He saw her coming and said something to the men around him. They scattered. Cora dropped the sack and the salt pork at his feet. "Stop," she said. "Just stop." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then he crouched, picked up the provisions, and held them out. "You need these. I do not need anything from you. You are barely eating. Half the town knows it. The fact that you are watching me is not a comfort," Cora said. The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with exhaustion she could not quite hide. She had not slept well in weeks. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's forged signature on the land claim, the neat loops and careful flourishes that had fooled everyone for 15 years. She saw the moment Wyatt had laid the original document on the land office desk. The ink faded, but the difference is unmistakable. She saw the way he had looked at her afterward, something like regret in his eyes, and she hated him for it. She did not want his regret. She wanted him to have been wrong. Wyatt set the provisions back on the ground between them. "I am not trying to make this worse." "Then leave me alone." "I cannot do that." The certainty in his voice made her chest tighten. "Why not?" "Because your father was not the only one involved in that land fraud," Wyatt said quietly. "And the people who were involved with him are still in Blue Bend. They know you have been asking questions. They know you have been going through his papers. And they are not going to let you keep digging." Cora felt the ground tilt under her boots. "What are you talking about? Your father did not forge those documents alone. He had a partner. Someone with access to the land office records. Someone who knew how to make the claim look legitimate." "Who?" Wyatt shook his head. "I do not know yet. But I know they exist. And I know they are watching you. That runaway wagon yesterday was not an accident. Someone cut the brake line." The cold seemed to sink deeper into her bones. "You are lying. I pulled the wagon into my yard after it stopped. I checked it myself. The cut was clean, deliberate. Someone wanted that team to bolt, and they wanted it to happen when you were standing on that boardwalk." Cora took a step back. Her mind raced, trying to fit this new information into the shape of what she already knew. Her father had died 6 months ago, a sudden fever that took him in less than a week. She had mourned him as an honest man, a good man, a man who had built something lasting in a hard country. Then, Wyatt had appeared at the land office with documents that proved her father was a fraud, and everything she believed had collapsed. She had thought the worst was over. She had thought the scandal would fade, the gossip would move on, and she could rebuild her life on what remained. She had not imagined that someone might want her dead. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you need to stop investigating. You need to let this go." The anger came back, hot and fierce. "Let it go? My entire life was built on a lie. My father's name is ruined. I have lost everything. And you want me to just stop asking why? I want you to stay alive. The words hung in the cold air between them. Cora stared at Wyatt, trying to read the truth behind his steady gaze. He looked tired, she realized. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there when he first came to Blue Bend 3 months ago. He looked like a man carrying weight he could not set down. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You destroyed my father's reputation. You took away everything I thought I had. Why would you care if someone wants me gone?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Because your father was not the villain in this story. He was a tool. Someone used him, and when he figured it out, they killed him." The world seemed to stop. Cora could not breathe, could not think. The fever, the sudden illness, the way her father had tried to speak in those last delirious hours, his hand clutching hers, his eyes desperate with something that looked like warning. She had thought it was grief. She had thought he was trying to say goodbye. "Prove it," she whispered. "I am trying. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to stop making yourself a target." Cora laughed, a bitter sound that scraped her throat. "Trust you? You are the reason I lost everything. I am the reason you know the truth." There is a difference. She wanted to slap him again. She wanted to scream. She wanted to collapse right there in the frozen mud and let someone else carry the weight for a while. Instead, she bent down, picked up the sack of cornmeal, and met his eyes. "If you want me to trust you," she said, "then stop treating me like I need to be rescued. Start treating me like a partner." Wyatt studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "All right. But we do this my way, and you do exactly what I say when things get dangerous. I am a newspaper editor, not a child. Then stop acting like you are invincible." The words stung because they were true. Cora had been reckless since her father died, chasing answers without caring about the cost. She had been so focused on clearing his name that she had not stopped to consider who might want to keep the truth buried. "Fine," she said. "Partners. But I want to see everything you have. Every document, every lead, every suspicion. No more secrets." Wyatt's mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile. No more secrets. Agreed. It was a lie, of course. They both knew it. Cora was still hiding the real reason she could not afford to trust him, and Wyatt was clearly holding back more than he was sharing. But it was a place to start, and starting was better than standing still while someone tried to kill her. "All right," she said. "When do we begin?" "Now. There is a dust storm coming in from the west. We have maybe 2 hours before it hits. I need to check the freight storage barn at the edge of town, and I need someone who knows how to read land claim documents. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then get your coat and meet me at the livery in 10 minutes. "And Cora?" She paused, already turning toward the street. "Bring a gun if you have one." The livery smelled like hay and horse sweat and old leather. Cora arrived with her father's revolver tucked into her satchel, the weight of it unfamiliar and unsettling. She had fired it exactly 3 times in her life, all at tin cans lined up on fence posts, and she had missed twice. But Wyatt did not need to know that. He was waiting with 2 horses already saddled, a lean sorrel mare for her, and a steady buckskin gelding for himself. The wind had picked up in the last 10 minutes, carrying the smell of dust and distance. The western sky had gone yellow-gray, a wall of storm building on the horizon. "We will not have much time," Wyatt said as he helped her mount. "The barn is a mile out, just past the Mercer property line. If the storm catches us, we shelter there and wait it out." "What are we looking for?" "Land claim copies. Your father stored duplicates of every transaction he processed when he worked at the land office. If his partner altered the official records, the duplicates might show the original entries." Cora settled into the saddle, her hands tightening on the reins. "Why would my father keep duplicates?" "Insurance, most likely. If things went wrong, he wanted proof of what really happened. So he knew. He knew someone was using him." Wyatt swung into his own saddle, his movements easy and practiced. "I think he figured it out near the end. I think that is why he died." They rode out of Blue Bend at a fast trot, the horses nervous and high-headed as the wind pushed against them. The road stretched pale and rutted before them, cutting through winter-brown prairie grass that bent and hissed under the storm's advance. Cora had ridden this way 100 times, but today everything felt different. The familiar landmarks, the distant ridgeline, the lone cottonwood that marked the turnoff to the Mercer place, all of it looked strange and exposed under the bruised sky. The barn came into view as the first dust devils began to dance across the open ground. It was an old structure, weathered gray and leaning slightly to the south, its doors hanging crooked on iron hinges. Wyatt dismounted and pushed the doors open, leading his horse inside. Cora followed, her mare skittish and pulling against the bit. Inside, the barn was dim and musty, filled with the shapes of old freight crates, broken wagon parts, and stacks of canvas tarps. A ladder led up to a loft thick with ancient hay. Wyatt tied the horses near the door where they could see out, then pulled a kerosene lantern from his saddlebag and struck a match. "The crates are in the back corner," he said, "marked with your father's initials. He stored them here 5 years ago and paid the freight company to keep them untouched. I found the receipt in his office papers after he died." Cora picked her way through the clutter, her skirt catching on splinters and nails. The storm was building outside, the wind screaming now, the light fading fast. By the time they reached the back corner, the first waves of dust were hammering the barn walls like fists. Wyatt set the lantern on a barrel and pried open the first crate. Inside were stacks of paper, yellowed and brittle, each one carefully folded and labeled in her father's precise handwriting. Cora's throat tightened. She recognized that handwriting. She had grown up reading his notes, his letters, his careful editorial corrections on her early attempts at journalism. She pulled out the first bundle and unfolded it. Land claim for the Mercer property, dated 1868. The signatures matched the official record. She set it aside and reached for the next. The Hanson Homestead, 1869. Also identical. The third document made her stop. It was a claim for the Larkspur Ranch, dated 1870, and the signature at the bottom was not her father's. It was someone else's, a scrawling, hasty mark that looked nothing like the careful forgery that had appeared in the official record. "This is it," she said. "This is the proof. The original claim was signed by someone else, and then later someone changed it to make it look like my father approved it." Wyatt leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm against her cheek. "Who signed it?" Cora tilted the paper toward the lamplight. The name was barely legible, scratched out in a hurry. She squinted, tracing the letters with her finger. "It looks like Dalton. James Dalton. Do you know that name?" "No. I have never heard of him." Wyatt straightened, his jaw tight. I have. He was a land office clerk 15 years ago. He disappeared the same year this claim was filed. People thought he went east, back to family in Missouri. Or someone made sure he could not talk. The barn shuddered as a particularly strong gust hit. Dust sifted down from the rafters, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. The horses stamped and whinnied, pulling at their ties. Outside, the world had disappeared into a churning brown wall. Visibility was zero. The storm had caught them, and they were not going anywhere until it passed. We need to keep looking, Wyatt said. If your father kept this, he might have kept more. Anything that connects Dalton to someone still in Blue Bend. They worked through the rest of the crate, pulling out document after document, spreading them across the barn floor in the lamplight. Most were routine, boring records of legitimate transactions. But every few pages, they found another discrepancy. Another signature that did not match. Another claim that had been altered after the fact. It was a pattern. Someone had been systematically stealing land for 15 years, using the land office records to cover their tracks. And her father had kept the proof. Why did he not take this to the law? Cora asked. Why did he just hide it? Wyatt sat back on his heels, his face grim in the lantern light. Because the law was in on it. Look at the dates. Every single altered claim was processed during months when Marshal Taggart was out of town on circuit duty. Someone in the land office was working with someone in local government, and they made sure no one was watching when they made their moves. So my father was protecting himself. And you. If he took this public, whoever was behind it would have killed him and destroyed the evidence. By hiding it, he kept you safe. At least until he was gone. Cora felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. Not here, not now, not in front of Wyatt Cutter. But the weight of it was crushing. Her father had not been a villain. He had been a man caught in something too big to fight, doing the only thing he could to protect his daughter. And she had spent 6 months hating his memory. Wyatt reached out, hesitated, then placed his hand over hers. The touch was warm, careful, nothing like the rough grab when he had pulled her from the wagon's path. Cora stared at their joined hands, her pulse loud in her ears. He tried, Wyatt said quietly. He tried to do the right thing the only way he knew how, and it killed him. Probably. Yes. The admission hung between them. Outside, the storm roared, shaking the barn like a living thing. Inside, the lamplight made everything feel small and close and strangely safe. Cora became aware of how near Wyatt was, the solid warmth of him, the way his thumb had started to trace small circles on the back of her hand. She should pull away. She should put distance between them. She should remember that this man had turned her world upside down, and nothing he said could change that. But she did not move. Why did you come to Blue Bend? She asked. What made you start looking into this? Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because my brother was involved. He worked for the freight company that moved supplies for the land office. He saw things he should not have seen, and he wrote to me about it. By the time I got his letter, he was dead. Thrown from a horse, they said. But my brother was the best rider I ever knew. He did not just fall. So you are here for revenge. I am here for the truth. Same as you. Cora turned her hand under his, lacing their fingers together. It felt dangerously easy, dangerously right. We are both trying to clear the names of dead men we loved. Yes. What happens when we find out who did this? Wyatt met her eyes, and she saw the dangerous edge there. The part of him that was not gentle or careful or safe. We make sure they pay. The storm battered the barn for 3 more hours. They went through every document in the crate, piecing together a picture of fraud that stretched back 15 years and involved at least 4 major landholdings in the county. The Larkspur Ranch was just one piece. There were others, all of them tied together by the same pattern of altered claims and disappeared witnesses. By the time the wind began to die down, Cora's back ached, and her eyes burned from reading in the dim light. But they had what they needed. They had proof. We need to take this to the territorial governor, she said. If the local law is compromised, we go higher. Agreed. But first we need to get out of here without anyone knowing what we found. If word gets back to Blue Bend that we were out here together during the storm, people will assume we sheltered here. They will not think twice about it. But if we show up with a crate full of documents, whoever is behind this will know we are onto them. So, we leave the documents here for now, Cora said. We go back to town separately. I return to the Gazette as if nothing happened. You go about your freight business. And we wait for them to make a move. Wyatt shook his head. No. You do not go back to that office alone. You stay somewhere public. The hotel? Maybe. Or with someone you trust. I cannot afford the hotel, and I do not have anyone I trust. Not anymore. Then, you stay with me. The suggestion hung in the air between them. Cora stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. That would destroy what is left of my reputation. You do not have a reputation left to destroy. You slapped me in front of the whole town, remember? That is not the same as moving into your house. I have a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen runs it. She is respectable, and she does not gossip. You take the room next to mine. We tell people you had damage from the storm and need temporary shelter. It is plausible. And when people see us coming and going together, when they start talking about what we are really doing, let them talk. I would rather have you alive and gossiped about than dead and respectable. Cora wanted to argue. She wanted to insist she could take care of herself. But the truth was, she was terrified. Someone had tried to kill her once already. Someone had murdered her father and Wyatt's brother and probably James Dalton, and who knew how many others. And now, she and Wyatt were the only ones who knew the truth. All right, she said. I will stay at the boarding house. But only until we can get these documents to the governor. Agreed. They repacked the crate and hid it under a pile of old tarps in the darkest corner of the barn. Then they led the horses out into the aftermath of the storm. The world was coated in dust, every surface soft and brown and strange. The sun hung low in the west, a pale disk behind the lingering haze. They had less than an hour of daylight left. They rode back toward Blue Bend slowly, letting the horses pick their way through the debris the storm had scattered across the road. Neither of them spoke. But halfway back, Wyatt reached over and took her hand again, and Cora let him. It felt like a promise. It felt like the beginning of something that terrified her almost as much as the unknown killer, waiting in Blue Bend. Mrs. Chen asked no questions when they arrived at the boarding house after dark, both of them coated in dust and exhausted. She simply nodded, handed Cora a key, and said, "Second floor, end of the hall. Supper is at 6, breakfast at 7. You need wash water? Please, Cora said. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the back alley. It was the first time in 6 months that Cora had slept anywhere but her own small apartment above the Gazette office, and the strangeness of it made her restless. She washed the dust from her face and hands, changed into her spare dress, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. On the other side of that wall, Wyatt was doing the same. She could hear the creak of floorboards, the sound of water being poured, the low rumble of his voice as he spoke to someone in the hallway. The nearness of him was unsettling. She kept thinking about the way his hand had felt over hers, the way his eyes had looked in the lamplight, the dangerous promise in his voice when he said they would make someone pay. She was falling for him. It was the worst possible timing, the worst possible choice, but she could not seem to stop it. A knock on the door made her jump. She crossed the room and opened it to find Wyatt standing in the hallway, his hair still damp from washing, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said. Cora stepped back to let him in. He closed the door behind him, but stayed near it, as if he did not trust himself to come farther into the room. The space between them felt charged, dangerous. "I did not tell you everything," he said, "about why I came to Blue Bend. I assumed. My brother wrote to me 2 months before he died. He said he had proof of the land fraud, and he said he knew who was behind it. But he did not put the name in the letter. He said it was too dangerous. He said he would tell me when I arrived, but he died before you got here." "Yes." And his papers were gone. His room had been searched. Everything that might have had answers was destroyed. "So you went to the land office and started investigating on your own?" Wyatt nodded. "I found your father's name in the records. I found the forged documents. And I thought he was the one. I thought he was the person my brother had discovered, but he was not. No. He was a victim, same as my brother. And I destroyed his reputation because I was too focused on revenge to see the truth." Cora felt her throat tighten. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know. And because I need you to understand that I did not come here to hurt you. I came here to stop the people who killed my brother. But in the process, I hurt you anyway, and I am sorry for that." The apology hit her harder than she expected. She had spent weeks hating him, blaming him, building walls between them. But standing here in this small room with the lamplight making shadows on his face, she could see the truth. He was just as lost as she was, just as desperate for answers, just as determined to make things right. "I slapped you in front of the whole town," she said. "I deserved it." "No, you did not. You were trying to find the truth. That is not something you apologize for." Wyatt took a step closer, then another. The space between them shrank to nothing. Cora could feel the heat of him, the solid realness of him, the way her body seemed to lean toward his without conscious choice. "I need you to know something else," he said, his voice low and rough. "I am going to find whoever killed your father. I am going to find whoever killed my brother. And I am going to make sure they pay. But I need you to promise me that you will let me handle it. I need you to promise me you will not do anything reckless." "I cannot promise that. Cora, I mean it. I am not going to stand by and let you take all the risk while I hide in a boarding house room. We are partners." That was the deal. Wyatt's jaw tightened. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met." "Good. Then we understand each other." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver down her spine. "If something happens to you," he said quietly, "I will not forgive myself. Then do not let anything happen to me." The kiss happened before either of them made a conscious decision. One moment they were standing there, the tension between them stretched tight as wire. The next, his mouth was on hers, and she was kissing him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, her whole body leaning into him. It was not gentle. It was desperate and fierce and full of all the fear and anger and longing they had been holding back. Wyatt's hands slid into her hair, scattering pins, and Cora made a small sound against his mouth that might have been surrender or triumph or both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cora rested her forehead against his chest and felt the rapid hammer of his heart under her palms. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered. "The worst," he agreed, but neither of them moved away. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended tension. Cora returned to the Gazette office each morning and tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy. She wrote articles about town meetings and new businesses and the upcoming church social. She set type and ran the press and delivered papers to subscribers. And every evening, she walked back to the boarding house and sat down to supper with Wyatt at Mrs. Chen's long table, surrounded by traveling salesmen and ranch hands and the occasional family passing through. They did not touch in public. They barely spoke beyond polite small talk. But every night, after the house went quiet, Wyatt knocked on her door, and they sat together in her small room, going over what they had learned, planning their next moves, building the case they would take to the territorial governor. And every night, the space between them grew smaller. On the 4th day, a stranger rode into Blue Bend. He arrived at noon, a tall man on a gray horse, his clothes dusty from hard travel and his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He tied his horse outside the land office and went inside. 10 minutes later, he came out and rode to the boarding house. Cora was at the Gazette when she heard. Timothy Harper came running in, breathless and wide-eyed, to tell her that a man was asking questions about her, asking where she lived, what she did, who she spent time with. "What did he look like?" Cora asked, her pulse quickening. "Tall, thin, had a scar on his jaw. And he wore a gun low, like he knew how to use it." "Where is he now?" "The boarding house. He took a room." Cora grabbed her coat and ran. She did not care that half the town saw her sprinting down the street in a most unladylike fashion. She did not care that people stopped and stared. She had to get to Wyatt before the stranger did. She burst through the boarding house door and nearly collided with Mrs. Chen. "Where is Wyatt?" "Out back, checking the stable." "But Miss Everly, there is a man." "I know. Lock the doors. Do not let anyone in or out until I say." Mrs. Chen's eyes went wide, but she nodded and moved toward the front entrance. Cora ran through the house and out the back door. The stable was a small structure behind the main building, just 3 stalls and a tack room. She found Wyatt inside, brushing down his horse. "We have a problem," she said. He looked up sharply. "What kind of problem?" "A man just arrived. He is asking questions about me. Timothy said he looks like a hired gun." Wyatt set down the brush and reached for his coat. Did Timothy say where he went? He took a room here. At the boarding house, Wyatt swore under his breath. All right. Stay here. I will handle it. No. We go together. This is not Camset. Cora, where the lost agobs bok hugimus al wist tyant. Cone like granding a dinsenkaldener. Cor from Hotter. Cor calming the bust or spones the Tories. We are partners. That was the deal. Now move. They went back into the house through the kitchen door. Mrs. Chen met them in the hallway, her face pale. He is upstairs. Second door on the left. He asked which room was yours. Wyatt pushed Cora behind him and drew the revolver from his belt. Stay behind me. If shooting starts, you run. Understand? Cora pulled her own gun from her satchel. I am not running. The look he gave her was equal parts frustration and something that might have been pride. Then he turned and started up the stairs, moving silent and fast. Cora followed, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The hallway upstairs was empty. The second door on the left stood slightly ajar. Wyatt paused outside it, listening. Then, he kicked it open and stepped through, gun raised. The room was empty. The stranger was gone. But on the bed lay a single piece of paper, folded once and sealed with wax. Wyatt picked it up, broke the seal, and read. His face went hard. We need to leave. Now, what does it say? It says if we want to know who killed our families, we should come to the Larkspur Ranch tonight at midnight. Alone. It is a trap. Of course it is a trap. But it is also our only chance to get answers. Wyatt, this is insane. Whoever wrote this is the same person who has been trying to kill us. I know. That is why we are not going alone. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Wyatt sent a coded telegram to the territorial marshal's office in the nearest county seat, explaining the situation and asking for backup. He bought extra ammunition and checked both their weapons. He drew maps of the Larkspur Ranch, marking every building, every approach, every possible ambush point. Cora wrote down everything they knew, every name, every document, every piece of evidence they had uncovered. She sealed it in an envelope and gave it to Mrs. Chen with instructions to deliver it to the land office if they did not return by morning. As the sun set and the town went quiet, they rode out of Blue Bend on the North Road, taking the long way around to approach the ranch from the east. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp overhead, the moon just past full. It was the kind of night that made everything visible for miles, the kind of night that offered no cover and no mercy. The Larkspur Ranch sat in a shallow valley surrounded by low hills. The main house was a two-story structure with a wide porch and dark windows. Behind it stood the barn, the bunkhouse, the storage sheds, all empty and abandoned since the land claim had been invalidated. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No light showed in any window. But there were horses tied outside the barn. At least 3, maybe more. Wyatt reined in at the top of the ridge and studied the scene. I count 4 horses. That means at least 4 people down there. Maybe more if some rode double. Can you tell who they are? Not from here. We will have to get closer. They left their own horses tied in a stand of cottonwoods and moved down the hill on foot, staying low and using the brush for cover. The night was so quiet Cora could hear her own heartbeat, the rasp of her breath, the whisper of grass under her boots. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sound made her flinch. They reached the barn and pressed against the wall, listening. Inside, voices murmured, low and indistinct. Wyatt motioned for her to stay put and edged toward the door. It stood open a crack, just enough to see inside. What he saw made him go still. Then he backed away and returned to Cora, his face grim in the moonlight. "It is a meeting," he whispered. "4 men. I recognize 2 of them. One is the deputy land clerk. The other is Marshal Taggart's brother-in-law. So the law is involved, just like we thought. Worse. The 3rd man is Connor Reed. He owns half the freight contracts in the county. If he is part of this, it means the operation is bigger than we thought. Who is the 4th man? I do not know. He has his back to the door. But he is the one doing most of the talking, and the others are listening like he is in charge. We need to get closer," Cora whispered. "We need to hear what they are saying." Wyatt hesitated. Then he nodded. "Stay low. Stay quiet. And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." They crept to the side of the barn where the walls were oldest and most weathered. There was a gap between 2 boards, just wide enough to see through. Cora pressed her eye to the gap and looked inside. The 4 men stood in a circle around a lantern. The deputy clerk was a nervous young man named Foster, who always looked like he was about to apologize for existing. The marshal's brother-in-law was a heavy-set rancher named Boone, who spent more time in the saloon than on his land. Connor Reed was a sharp-faced businessman in his 50s, dressed too well for a midnight meeting in an abandoned barn. And the 4th man, the one with his back to the wall, was someone she recognized. Someone she had known her entire life. Someone she had trusted. It was Dr. Samuel Holt, the town physician. Cora felt the ground tilt under her feet. Dr. Holt had delivered her when she was born. He had treated her childhood illnesses. He had sat with her father during those last terrible hours, holding his hand and promising everything would be all right. He had been there when her father died. He had signed the death certificate. He had told her it was a fever, quick and merciless, nothing anyone could have done. He had lied. Beside her, Wyatt had gone rigid. He sees it too, she realized. He knows. Inside the barn, Dr. Holt was speaking. His voice was calm, measured, the same voice he used when discussing treatment plans and medicine doses. "We have 2 problems," he said. "The Cutter man and the Everly woman. They have been asking questions. They went to the old freight barn during the storm. I had someone watching. They found the documents. The documents should have been destroyed years ago," Boone said. "You promised they were taken care of. I thought they were. Clearly, I was wrong. So what do we do?" Foster asked, his voice shaking. "Do we kill them?" Dr. Holt sighed, a sound of infinite patience. Killing them now would draw too much attention, especially after the failed wagon incident. "No, we need to be smarter. We need to discredit them first. Make it look like they are working together to fabricate evidence. Then, when they disappear, no one will care." "How do we discredit them?" Reed asked. "Simple. We spread rumors. The freight foreman and the newspaper editor, carrying on an affair, desperate to cover up their own financial crimes. We plant forged documents in Cutter's room. We make it look like he has been stealing from the freight company. We make it look like Everly has been embezzling from the Gazette. By the time we are done, this town will be happy to see them gone. And if that does not work, Boone asked, then we kill them and make it look like a murder-suicide. Simple. Clean. Final. The cold certainty in his voice made Cora's blood freeze. This was not a man struggling with a terrible decision. This was a man who had done this before, many times, and had refined his methods to an art. "We need to leave," Wyatt breathed in her ear. "Now." But before they could move, a voice spoke from behind them. "I would not do that, if I were you." They spun around. The stranger from the boarding house stood 10 feet away, his gun drawn and aimed directly at Wyatt's chest. In the moonlight, the scar on his jaw looked like a pale slash, and his eyes were flat and cold. "Inside," Cora whispered. "Smart," the stranger said. "Move." They had no choice. They walked through the barn door with their hands raised, the stranger behind them, his gun steady. The 4 men inside looked up, surprise and anger flashing across their faces. "Well," Dr. Holt said, "this is unfortunate." Wyatt kept his voice level. "You killed my brother. Your brother was careless. He asked too many questions and wrote too many letters. He left me no choice." "And my father?" Cora asked, her voice shaking with rage. "What did he do?" "Your father grew a conscience at the worst possible time," Dr. Holt said. "He threatened to take the documents to the territorial governor. He said he could not live with what he had done. So I made sure he did not have to live with it at all. A little something in his evening tea, fast-acting, impossible to trace. By the time I arrived to treat him, it was too late. Such a tragedy." "You are insane," Cora said. "I am practical. This territory is full of land, and land is money. All it takes is a little paperwork, a few strategic deaths, and patience. I have been building this operation for 20 years. I am not going to let a freight foreman and a newspaper editor destroy it." Wyatt took a step forward. The stranger's gun swung toward him. "Stop." Dr. Holt raised a hand. "No. Let him move. I want to see what he thinks he is going to do." Wyatt took another step, then another. His eyes never left Dr. Holt's face. "You made one mistake." "Only one?" Dr. Holt smiled. "Do tell. You assumed we came alone." The barn door slammed open. 6 men poured through, all wearing territorial marshal badges, all with guns drawn. The stranger spun, trying to bring his weapon around, but he was too slow. 2 deputies tackled him to the ground. Boone made a break for the back door and ran straight into another marshal. Foster dropped to his knees and put his hands on his head, whimpering. Connor Reed tried to draw his pistol. Wyatt moved faster, closing the distance and slamming his fist into Reed's jaw. The man went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. Dr. Holt stood perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his expression calm. "You telegraphed for help." "Clever." "Not clever," Wyatt said. "Prepared." The territorial marshal stepped forward, a tall man with a weathered face and cold eyes. "Dr. Samuel Holt, you are under arrest for conspiracy, land fraud, and murder. You have the right to remain silent, but I suggest you do not bother." We have enough evidence to hang you twice over. Dr. Holt smiled. Evidence can be destroyed. Witnesses can be silenced. Not this time, Cora said. She pulled a folded document from inside her coat. This is a full confession, written and signed by James Dalton 3 days before he disappeared. He left it with my father for safekeeping. It names you, Dr. Holt. It names every crime, every victim, every altered land claim. My father hid it with all the other documents, and tonight I sent a copy to the Territorial Governor's office, the Land Claims Bureau, and 3 separate newspapers. Even if something happens to us, the truth is already out there. Dr. Holt's smile faded. His face went pale. Then, slowly, he sank onto a barrel, his shoulders slumping. It is over, he said quietly. It is finally over. The marshals took the prisoners away in chains. Dr. Holt went quietly, his face blank. The others fought and cursed and made threats that meant nothing. By the time the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, the Larkspur Ranch was empty again, the barn doors standing open to the cold morning air. Cora and Wyatt stood side by side on the porch of the main house, watching the last wagon disappear over the ridge. Neither of them had slept. Neither of them had spoken much. There had been statements to give, evidence to hand over, questions to answer. But now it was done. The truth was out. The guilty were caught, and they were still alive. What happens now? Cora asked. Wyatt turned to look at her. The rising sun lit his face, softening the hard edges, making him look younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. Now we rebuild. We clear your father's name. We clear my brother's name. We make sure everyone knows they were victims, not villains. And after that, I was hoping you might let me stay in Blue Bend. Cora felt her breath catch. Why? Because there is a newspaper editor here I have grown rather fond of. And because I think this town could use an honest freight foreman. And because I am tired of running. I want to build something. I want to stay. What if the town does not forgive me for slapping you in public? Then, we will change their minds. Together. Cora smiled. The first real smile she had felt in months. Together. I like the sound of that. Wyatt reached out and took her hand. So do I. They stood there on the porch as the sun rose, painting the prairie gold and pink and endless. The wind had shifted, carrying the smell of grass and distance and the promise of spring. Somewhere in Blue Bend, people were waking up. Somewhere. Coffee was brewing, and bread was baking, and life was going on. And for the first time since her father died, Cora felt like she could be part of it again. The town meeting was held 3 days later in the church hall. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, craning to see. The territorial marshal stood at the front and laid out the case in clear, precise language. He named names. He showed documents. He explained how Dr. Holt and his accomplices had stolen thousands of acres of land over 2 decades, and how they had murdered anyone who got in their way. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, people began to stand. First one, then another, then whole families rising to their feet. Someone started clapping. Others joined in. Within moments, the entire hall was applauding, and Cora realized they were not clapping for the marshal. They were clapping for her, for Wyatt, for the truth. Afterward, people crowded around her, shaking her hand, apologizing for doubting her father, thanking her for bringing the truth to light. Mrs. Kowalski hugged her so hard her ribs ached. Timothy Harper asked if he could write an article about it for the school paper. Even old Samuel, no relation to Dr. Holt despite the shared first name, stopped to tip his hat and say, "Your father would be proud." Cora made her way through the crowd to where Wyatt stood near the back door. He was talking to a group of freight workers, but when he saw her, he excused himself and met her halfway. "We did it," she said. "You did it." "I just helped." "No. We did it. Together." He smiled, and the warmth in his eyes made her heart turn over. "So what is next?" "Next, I run a newspaper, and you run a freight company, and we see what happens." Sounds like a plan, but Cora was not done. There was one more thing she needed to say. One more thing she needed him to know. "Wyatt, when I slapped you, I was not angry because you told the truth. I was angry because I thought it meant I could not trust you. I thought it meant you were my enemy. And now I know better. Now I know you are the most trustworthy person I have ever met." Wyatt reached up and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized was falling. "I spent so long looking for revenge that I almost missed the chance to find something better. I almost missed you." The church hall had emptied around them. They were alone in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by empty chairs and the echo of voices. Cora stepped closer, closing the last small distance between them. "Do not miss me now," she said. "I would not dream of it." He kissed her there in the empty hall, slow and sweet and full of promise. And when they finally broke apart, Cora knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead. There would be work to do, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. 6 months later, the Larkspur Ranch belonged to Cora again. The territorial governor had overturned the fraudulent land claim and restored her father's name. She sold most of the acreage to neighboring ranchers, keeping only the main house and enough land for a small working ranch. It was not the empire her father had dreamed of, but it was honest, and it was hers. Wyatt moved his freight operation to a new warehouse on the edge of Blue Bend, and within 3 months, he had contracts with every ranch and business in the county. People trusted him. People knew his word was good. And when he proposed to Cora on a cold November evening, standing in the doorway of the Gazette office with snow beginning to fall, she said yes without hesitation. They were married in the spring, in the same church hall where the truth had finally come to light. Half the town attended. Mrs. Chen made the cake. Timothy Harper served as ring bearer. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was so loud it shook the rafters. Afterward, they rode out to the Larkspur Ranch together, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Wyatt had spent the last month fixing up the house, repairing the roof, replacing broken windows, making it livable again. Tonight would be their first night there, as a married couple. Cora stood on the porch and looked out over the land. It was not much, just a few hundred acres of prairie grass and stubborn hope. But it was theirs. It was clean. It was built on truth. Wyatt came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking my father would have liked you." "You think so?" "I know so. You did what he could not. You finished what he started. You made sure the truth came out. We did it together. Yes. Together. They stood there as the last light faded and the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind whispered through the grass. The world was wide and wild and full of possibility. And for the first time in a very long time, Cora felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The following winter brought hard cold and deep snow, but the ranch house stayed warm. Wyatt worked the freight routes during the day, and Cora ran the Gazette from a new office in town. In the evenings, they came home together, cooked supper together, sat by the fire together. There were no more secrets between them. No more lies. Just the steady, quiet work of building a life. In February, Cora discovered she was expecting a child. She told Wyatt on a snowy evening, standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands and hope in her eyes. He stared at her for a long moment, speechless. Then, he swept her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. "Boy or girl?" "I do not know yet." "Does it matter?" "Not even a little." The baby came in early October, a healthy girl with auburn hair and her father's steady eyes. They named her Rose, after Cora's mother, and she filled the house with noise and chaos and more joy than Cora had thought possible. On Rose's first birthday, they threw a party at the ranch. Half of Blue Bend showed up, bringing food and gifts and laughter. Timothy Harper, now working as a junior reporter at the Gazette, took photographs. Mrs. Chen brought a cake decorated with sugar flowers. Even the territorial marshal stopped by to pay his respects and dandle the baby on his knee. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Cora stood on the porch with Rose in her arms and watched Wyatt say goodbye to the last visitors. He looked older now, a little more weathered, a little more settled. But his eyes still held that same dangerous edge, that same fierce determination. He caught her watching and smiled. "What?" "Nothing. I am just happy." "Good. You should be." He came up the steps and stood beside her, one arm around her shoulders, the other reaching out to touch Rose's soft cheek. The baby gurgled and grabbed his finger, holding on tight. "We did all right," he said quietly. "Yes, we did." And Cora knew it was true. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built something whole. They had faced down lies and danger and loss, and they had come through it together. They had found love in the last place either of them expected, and they had made it last. The sun sank below the horizon, and the first stars appeared. The wind carried the smell of autumn, of wood smoke and turning leaves, and the promise of seasons to come. Rose yawned and nestled against Cora's shoulder, her tiny hand still gripping Wyatt's finger. Inside the house, the lamps were lit. The fire was burning. Supper was waiting. It was time to go in. Time to close the door on the past and turn toward the future. Time to live the life they had fought so hard to build, together.